All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a narrative that is just as philosophically devastating as it is visually striking. We are stepping straight into a grim, dark fable. Imagine a world entirely steeped in this heavy twilight energy, completely suffering from the leaden weight of total cultural decadence. This is a society that made a truly terrifying choice. They actually draped their entire sky in a massive veil of silk just so they would never, ever have to look up and face reality again. They built this complete architecture of denial. But what happens when the truth you've tried so hard to bury finds a way to shine straight up from the very ground beneath your feet? That's the mythic journey we're exploring today. We're going to look at how a single, inescapable reflection manages to completely shatter an entire society's foundation of lies.
Picture our traveler for a second. They're walking through this hushed, totally exhausted world, and they end up standing right at the edge of a pool of wild water. Now, for generations, their people made a pact to just never look up. They feel safe under this comforting, fabricated sky. But as our traveler looks down into the untouched earth, they get hit with this sudden, blinding shock. The sun, in all of its fierce, ancient glory, is reflecting perfectly off the surface of the water. The actual world they abandoned is staring right back at them. And the crazy part? It's not coming from the heavens they blocked out. It's coming from the raw earth below. So this reflection isn't just a trick of the light. The source text calls it a diagnostic strike, and that phrasing is absolutely crucial. The gatherers honestly thought they'd solved the whole problem of existence by creating their true sky. It was a literal and metaphorical silk canopy meant to hide the chaotic weather of the universe. They essentially built themselves a bloodless sanctuary. But this wild mirror of water, it completely circumvents that entire architecture of denial. The intense glare of the sun acts with incredible philological precision. It literally strips away the very words and meanings their entire society is built on, sounding out the hollow, empty frequency of their civilization. It forces the traveler to see that their so-called true world is nothing more than a linguistic fable. It's just a grammatical shield, and it is entirely failing to hold back the unbearable insistence of reality.
Part 1. The Linguistic Shield. To really grasp the weight of this, we have to understand how these gatherers were blinded in the first place. Look at this stark contrast we're dealing with here. On one side, you've got this cowardly linguistic fable of the silk sky, a canopy that essentially breeds denial and spiritual exhaustion. But then, on the other side, you have the wild mirror. It delivers this unbearable insistence of reality, just surging with a fierce golden vitality. The water basically proves that the actual wild world outranks their fabricated textile sky in every conceivable way. So how exactly did they reach this level of spiritual exhaustion? Well, a veil, if left unattended, is really just cloth, right? Any kid who climbed high enough could eventually look right past it. Because of that, a powerful priesthood caste rose, and they called themselves the Unweavers. The irony is, they wove nothing and they unwove nothing. Their entire office was just interpretation. They managed to convince the gatherers to worship the slow dissolution of their own instincts. Every single settlement used to keep these old iron anchors. They represented old words, old instincts, the heavy iron things sunk deep to hold a life in place against its own restlessness. But the Unweavers taught a totally different path, which brings us to this chilling quote. They'd praised not the anchor's grip, but its decay. The Unweavers actually composed something called the Litany of Rust, and the genius of it was, they didn't ask the people to truly believe in the silk true sky, they just asked them to recite the liturgy every day. They completely inverted the Greek concept of liturgia, which means a public work or service. In this world, the true labor of the liturgy was the private, systematic disarming of the individual's instinct for self-preservation. But it was disguised as an act of collective devotion. The words were constructed so carefully that actual genuine belief became totally superfluous. The daily recitation literally did the kneeling for you. Which brings us to a deeply Nietzschean concept, resentment. This is the act of turning your own weakness into a moral virtue purely out of spite. Now, a single generation's fear of the sun, that's just an accident of history. But when you have a priesthood like the Unweavers devoted to administering that fear, generation after generation, it becomes a permanent morality. Those very few individuals who actually scraped the rust away, the ones who wanted their iron anchors to hold strong rather than just slowly rot, they were actively shamed by this priesthood. They were called prideful. They were told they were diseased with self-love, and they were made to feel ashamed of simply wanting to be strong. The Unweavers successfully moved the lie from the sky directly into the very bodies of the people. Part 2. The Traveler as the Metallurgist. With all that dark history in mind, let's bring our narrative back to the present moment at the Wild Pool. Our traveler is staring into the water exactly like a metallurgist analyzing a vein of ore, trying to find its true frequency. This is a philological assay. They suddenly realize the unweaver's vocabulary is entirely inverted. What the priest had called constancy was actually just the decay of instinct. Grace and patience? That was just quiet failure and corrosion. Peace was nothing but profound spiritual exhaustion. And virtue? That was merely a convenient mask for the castration of natural instinct. The mirror brilliantly exposes the deeply hollow ring of the gatherer's entire moral framework.
Part 3. The Sun's Ontological Violence. Now, when the sun reflects out of that wild water, it doesn't just passively shine. It strikes, and it strikes with absolute violence. Let's break down the mechanics of this strike. At the exact zenith of their cultural exhaustion, the light pierces through, not from the heavens they blocked out, but from the wild soil they had completely dismissed as just a crude shadow. This triggers a massive, involuntary transvaluation of values within the traveler. This fierce light initiates what the text calls a noonday interrogation. It demands absolute accountability. It demands to know why on earth this society willfully traded the dangerous, thrilling lightning of real life for a suffocating blanket of silk.
You can almost feel the sheer weight of this ontological violence. It completely shatters the linguistic shield. It hits the water surface and rings with the density of a life actually lived at the edge of its own strength. That's a stark, undeniable contrast to the bloodless sanctuary of the gatherers. The reflection proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that humanity had been tricked. They'd been tricked into worshiping the very rust that was eating their own anchors from within. And worse, they were taught to call that decay a sacrament.
Part 4. Rebirth of the Roots.
Okay, let's look at how this absolute destruction builds into an incredibly triumphant rebirth. Because this subversion sets off a powerful chain reaction. First off, the wild water utterly shatters the litany of rust. The words can simply no longer do the kneeling for them. Second, the traveler makes a radical, terrifying choice. They accept the sun's overwhelming, perceived violence, realizing that this fierce truth is actually their only real source of warmth. Third, the comforting lies of the draped orchard, that whole metaphysical lie, are completely pruned away. And finally, pruning that graveyard allows the living to actually thrive again. It restores the philology of power, allowing deep roots to grow back, based on the raw strength of struggle, rather than celebrating the total absence of it.
And that is the ultimate takeaway of our fable. The truth was never going to be found up in the fabricated heavens, and it certainly wasn't in the exhausting, endless interpretations of the unweavers. The truth was just waiting, patiently, to be unearthed in the wild reflection below. The winter of man finally ends here, because the sun, acting as this ancient, fiercely affirmative force, looks back at them from the depths of the wild soil. And in doing so, it awakens that ruthless hunger for life they had all almost completely forgotten. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and to a rather provocative question I want to leave you with today. When you look closely at the narratives governing your own life, those comforting silks you might have draped over uncomfortable truths, are you holding on to your iron? Are you keeping your instincts sharp against the rough weather of reality? Or, like the gatherers, have you slowly learned to worship your own rust? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the architecture around you.